The massive courtroom stretched out like a cathedral made of crystal and steel. Beings from across the galaxy filled every seat, their strange forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes that would have amazed any human who had never left Earth. But Kate Morrison was not amazed. She sat at the defendant's table with her hands folded, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, looking more like someone's grandmother than a decorated military pilot. The charges against her were serious. War crimes, mass murder, the destruction of a civilian transport ship called Harmony's Dream. Over 3,000 alien refugees had died when her fighter craft fired the killing shot. The prosecution had spent 2 days painting her as a monster, a human who had let her species' violent nature take control. Judge Veltar towered over the courtroom from his high bench. The Xanathi was nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 glowing blue eyes and skin that looked like it was made of living glass. His translator device hung around his neck, converting his complex language into words that all the different species could understand. He had been chosen to lead this trial because his people were known for their fairness and their ability to see truth through lies. The prosecutor, an insect-like Kree named Zixtal, clicked his mandibles as he presented the evidence. Security footage showed Morrison's fighter approaching the transport ship. Communication logs proved that she had received the order to fire. The ship's identification beacon clearly marked it as a civilian vessel, carrying refugees from a war zone in the Outer Rim. Morrison's defense attorney, Captain Ryan Clark, looked tired and defeated. He was a good man, Kate knew, but he was fighting a battle with no weapons. The evidence was clear. The facts were simple. A human pilot had destroyed a ship full of innocent aliens, and now she had to pay the price. The human delegation sat in a special section reserved for Earth's representatives. Admiral Lisa Grant led the group, her uniform covered in medals from conflicts that most people in the courtroom had never heard of. She watched the proceedings with a stone face, but Kate could see the worry in her old friend's eyes. Behind the admiral sat diplomats and military officers, all trying to figure out how to save one of their own, without making things worse for humanity's place in the galactic community. The alien observers whispered among themselves in dozens of languages. Some called for Kate's immediate execution. Others demanded that all humans be banned from carrying weapons in space. A few even suggested that Earth should be cut off from the Galactic Alliance completely. Humans had always been seen as too violent, too quick to choose war over peace. This trial was proof, they said, that giving weapons to humans had been a mistake from the beginning. Captain Clark stood to present his defense, but what could he say? The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were credible. The facts spoke for themselves. He tried to argue that Morrison had been following orders, but that only made things worse. If human command was ordering attacks on civilian ships, then the problem was bigger than just one pilot. The Velnari delegation watched with special interest. Their people had been the ones most affected by human expansion into their territory. Ambassador Zekthar, with his serpentine body coiled in his chair, had already called for severe punishment. His scales shifted from green to deep red whenever he looked at Morrison, showing his anger in the way his species always did. Kate listened to it all with the same calm expression she had worn for 2 days. She had expected this outcome from the moment she was arrested. The evidence was real. She had fired the shot that destroyed Harmony's Dream. She had killed those refugees. The fact that she had done it to save billions of humans was something she could never prove without revealing secrets that would destroy more than just her own life. The prosecution finished their case with a dramatic display of the victims. Holographic images of the dead filled the air above the courtroom. Families, children, elderly beings who had lived through wars and disasters only to die when a human pilot decided their lives didn't matter. The effect on the jury was obvious. Several alien jurors made sounds of disgust or sorrow. One had to leave the room entirely. Judge Veltar called for the defendant to respond to the charges. This was Kate's chance to speak, to defend herself, to explain why she had done what she did. Captain Clark had prepared a speech for her, something about following orders and the fog of war and how sorry she was for the loss of life. But Kate knew that no speech would save her now. She stood slowly, her joints stiff from sitting too long. At 62 years old, she felt every one of her years. The injuries from decades of military service had never fully healed. The stress of keeping secrets for 20 years had aged her beyond her time. She looked small and frail standing in the massive courtroom, surrounded by beings who wanted her dead. Judge Veltar spoke in his complex language, and the translator converted his words into something everyone could understand. He asked her to state her response to the charges. He asked if she admitted her guilt or if she claimed innocence. He asked if she had anything to say in her own defense. Kate opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The advanced audio systems in the courtroom struggled to pick up her words. Judge Veltar leaned forward, his four eyes focusing on her with growing impatience. The courtroom fell silent as everyone strained to hear what she was saying, but Kate's words were too quiet. Even the sensitive microphones couldn't capture them clearly. The translator flickered and showed error messages as it tried to process sounds that weren't quite there. Captain Clark looked at her with confusion and concern. Admiral Grant half rose from her seat as if she wanted to help but didn't know how. The silence stretched on for long seconds. Kate stood at the defendant's table, her lips moving slightly, but no one could hear what she was trying to say. The alien observers began to whisper among themselves again, some suggesting that she was trying to waste the court's time or mock the proceedings. Judge Veltar's skin began to flush with the purple color that showed frustration in his species. His four eyes narrowed as he looked down at the small human woman, who seemed unable or unwilling to speak loud enough for the court to hear. The translator around his neck sparked once as it tried to process the faint sounds coming from the defendant's table. The moment stretched like a held breath, and Kate Morrison stood in the center of it all, about to speak words that would change everything. Judge Veltar's four eyes blazed brighter as his patience finally ran out. His translator crackled with static as he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of trials. The words came out sharp and clear in the common tongue that all species in the courtroom could understand. "Speak up, defendant," he commanded, his glowing gaze fixed on Kate Morrison like spotlights. "The court requires your response to be audible to all present. This tribunal will not be mocked by whispers and games." The alien observers murmured their agreement. Some of the insect-like Kree clicked their mandibles in approval. The crystalline beings from the Andor system chimed softly, their bodies resonating with harmonics that showed their support for the judge's demand. Even some of the more patient species, like the tree-like Groot collective, rustled their leaves in a way that suggested growing irritation. Kate Morrison lifted her head slowly, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked directly at Judge Veltar. Her gray eyes met his four glowing orbs without fear or shame. There was something different in her posture now, something that hadn't been there moments before. The defeated slump of her shoulders straightened slightly, and her hands unfolded from their resting position. When she spoke again, her voice was still quiet, but it carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Every word was precise and deliberate, spoken with the kind of careful pronunciation that suggested military training. The advanced audio systems had no trouble capturing the sound this time, and the translator devices throughout the room processed her words instantly. Ghost 77. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every human in the courtroom went rigid as if they had been struck by lightning. Captain Ryan Clark, who had been shuffling through his papers in preparation for damage control, dropped his stylus. The small metal object clattered onto the floor and rolled under the table, but Clark didn't seem to notice. His face had gone completely white, and his mouth opened and closed without making any sound. Admiral Lisa Grant shot to her feet so quickly that her chair toppled backward. The heavy piece of furniture crashed to the floor with a sound that echoed through the crystal chamber, but Grant didn't look back. Her eyes were locked on Kate Morrison with an expression of shock and growing horror. Her hands trembled as she reached for the communication device on her belt. Behind the Admiral, the rest of the human delegation was in chaos. Colonel Pete Barnes grabbed his aide's arm so hard that the younger man winced. General Patricia Stone had gone pale as death, her decorated uniform suddenly seeming too heavy for her shoulders. Even the diplomatic staff, who were supposed to stay calm in any situation, looked like they had seen a ghost. The alien observers noticed the change immediately. Judge Veltar's four eyes moved from Kate to the humans and back again, trying to understand what had caused such a dramatic reaction to two simple words. His translator had processed the phrase without difficulty, but the meaning seemed to escape him entirely. To most of the non-human species in the room, Ghost 77 was just a combination of a common word and some numbers. But the humans knew better. They knew what those words meant, and they knew what it meant that Kate Morrison had just spoken them in open court. Some of them looked sick. Others looked terrified. A few looked angry, as if Kate had just committed another crime right in front of them. Kate continued speaking in that same quiet, controlled voice. Each word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the human delegation that grew stronger with every syllable. Ghost 77, requesting emergency authentication. Operation Nightfall protocols are in effect. Admiral Grant's communication device beeped as she activated emergency channels that hadn't been used in over 15 years. Her voice shook as she spoke into the device, using code words and encryption sequences that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. Around the courtroom, other human military personnel were doing the same thing, their faces growing paler as they accessed files that officially didn't exist. Judge Veltar watched this display with growing confusion and anger. His skin began to flush the deep purple color that showed extreme frustration in his species. The translator around his neck sparked more frequently as he tried to process what was happening. "Order in the court," he bellowed, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic design. "The defendant will explain the relevance of this call sign immediately. This tribunal does not recognize human military classifications or secret protocols." But Admiral Grant was already moving, her security detail forming a protective circle around her as she made her way toward the exit. Her communication device crackled with urgent voices speaking in codes that made no sense to the alien observers. Emergency authorization requests were flying through channels that were buried so deep in human military bureaucracy that most people forgot they existed. Captain Clark finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again, addressing the judge while his eyes remained fixed on Kate Morrison. "Your Honor, my client has just invoked protocols that classify her testimony under the Human Military Secrets Act. I need to consult with Earth Command immediately. This changes everything." The Velnari delegation was becoming agitated. Ambassador Zekthar uncoiled from his chair, his serpentine body rising to its full 8-foot height. His scales had shifted to a deep red color that showed anger and suspicion among his people. "More human tricks," he hissed, his words translated for all to hear. "First they murder innocent refugees, then they hide behind their secret military codes. How convenient that these protocols appear just when justice is about to be served." But even as he spoke, Zekthar could see that something significant was happening among the humans. This wasn't a desperate legal maneuver or a stalling tactic. The reactions were too real, too immediate. Whatever Ghost 77 meant, it had genuinely shocked every human in the room. Other alien observers began to whisper among themselves in dozens of languages. The insect-like Kree delegation clicked and buzzed as they tried to understand what was happening. The crystalline Andor beings chimed in harmonies that suggested curiosity mixed with concern. Even the normally calm tree-like representatives of the Groot Collective were rustling their leaves in patterns that showed agitation. Kate Morrison remained seated at the defendant's table, but the change in her was obvious to anyone who looked closely. The defeated woman who had slouched in her chair for 2 days was gone. In her place sat someone with the rigid posture of a career military officer. Her hands were folded again, but now it looked like parade rest rather than despair. Judge Veltar pounded his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to his courtroom. The sound echoed through the crystal chamber like gunshots, but it did little to calm the chaos that had erupted among the human delegation. "This court will recess for 1 hour, he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "When we reconvene, the defendant will explain these protocols, or she will be held in contempt. I will not allow human military secrets to interfere with galactic justice." But as the various delegations filed out of the courtroom, everyone could see that this trial had just become something much bigger than a simple war crimes case. Whatever Kate Morrison had just revealed, it was something that had the power to shake the foundations of human society and possibly the entire Galactic Alliance. Admiral Grant was the last human to leave the courtroom, still speaking urgently into her communication device. As she passed Kate's table, their eyes met for just a moment. The look that passed between them contained 20 years of buried secrets and the terrible knowledge that those secrets were about to come to light. Admiral Lisa Grant stood in the secure communication chamber aboard Kepler Station, her hands shaking as she entered codes that she had memorized 20 years ago and hoped never to use again. The encryption sequences were burned into her memory like scars, each one representing a level of classification that went beyond anything the galactic community knew existed. The chamber itself was a marvel of human paranoia and engineering. Built into the heart of the station's human section, it was surrounded by layers of quantum shielding that could block any known form of surveillance. The walls hummed with white noise generators that would scramble any attempt at electronic eavesdropping. Even the air was filtered and recycled to prevent chemical analysis. General Peter Hayes appeared on the holographic display, his weathered face showing the strain of being woken from sleep by emergency protocols that hadn't been activated in 2 decades. Behind him, Grant could see the controlled chaos of the Pentagon's deepest emergency command center. Officers moved with the urgent efficiency of people who knew that every second could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. "Confirm authentication," Hayes said without preamble. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent his entire career dealing with secrets that could destroy nations. Grant's voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Ghost 77 has broken cover. Full identity confirmation in open court. Kate Morrison is requesting emergency authentication under Nightfall protocols." Hayes closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "Jesus Christ, Lisa, are you certain?" Voice print analysis confirms it's her. Biometric scanners show stress patterns consistent with someone operating under extreme duress. But the authentication codes are perfect. She knows things that only Ghost 77 would know. The implications hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Ghost 77 wasn't just any call sign. It represented one of the most classified operations in human military history. Something so secret that even its existence was denied by every government agency that had ever been asked about it. Hayes rubbed his face with both hands, looking like a man who was trying to wake up from a nightmare. The Nightfall files were sealed under presidential authority. Only 7 people in the entire government have access to them, and 3 of those are dead. 8 people, Grant corrected quietly. Kate Morrison was there. She lived through it. And now she's about to be executed by aliens who think she's a war criminal. The silence stretched between them as both officers contemplated the impossible situation they now faced. On the holographic display, Grant could see other figures moving in the background of the command center. Emergency protocols were being activated across multiple agencies. People who hadn't spoken to each other in decades were being dragged out of retirement and classified meetings. Hayes finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that no one should ever have to make. The Harmony's Dream incident. Morrison destroyed it 20 years ago, and we let everyone think it was a war crime. The refugee story was our cover, because the truth would have started a war, Grant finished. The Velnari pathogen project was classified beyond black. If the galactic community had known what their extremists were planning, it would have meant the end of the alliance. Both officers remembered the classified briefings from 20 years ago. Intelligence reports that painted a picture of biological warfare on a scale that would have made the ancient weapons of mass destruction look like toys. A pathogen designed specifically to target human DNA, engineered by Velnari extremists who believed that the galaxy would be better off without the violent, aggressive human species. The Harmony's Dream had been the delivery system. Disguised as a refugee transport, it had been carrying enough weaponized pathogen to kill every human on 3 separate colony worlds. The attack was supposed to happen during harvest festivals, when population density would ensure maximum casualties and the pathogen would have the best chance to spread. Grant remembered the desperate hours in the Situation Room as intelligence agencies tracked the ship's movements. They had 17 minutes to make a decision that would save 3 billion human lives or let a decorated pilot be branded as a war criminal forever. Kate took the shot because we ordered her to, Grant said quietly. Ghost 77 followed orders and saved humanity, and we thanked her by letting everyone think she was a monster. Hayes nodded grimly. The cover story was her idea. She said it was better to let one person carry the blame than to expose the truth and watch the Alliance tear itself apart. We gave Ghost Squadron new identities and listed them all as killed in action. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Kate Morrison had volunteered to be erased from existence to protect the secret that would have destroyed human relations with the galactic community. For 20 years, she had lived under a false name, carrying the weight of being branded a war criminal by the very people she had saved. Grant's communication device chimed with an urgent message. The trial was about to reconvene, and Judge Veltar was demanding answers that the human government couldn't give, without revealing state secrets that could destabilize the entire galactic alliance. "What are our options?" Grant asked. Though she already knew the answer would be terrible. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, consulting with advisors who appeared as shadows on the edge of the holographic display. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of impossible choices. "We can reveal the truth about the Velnari pathogen project and save Morrison. But that means exposing Operation Nightfall and probably starting a war with the Velnari. Or we can maintain the cover story and let an innocent woman die to protect secrets that maybe should have stayed buried." Grant felt the familiar weight of command decisions settling on her shoulders. These were the choices that kept officers awake at night. The decisions that had no right answers and consequences that would ripple through history. "There's a third option," she said slowly. "We can let Kate tell her own story. Ghost 77 has clearance for emergency disclosure if the situation requires it. She can reveal as much or as little as she thinks necessary." Hayes shook his head. "Lisa, you know what that means. If she tells the truth, it won't just be about the pathogen. She'll have to explain Ghost Squadron, the black operations, the cover-ups. Everything we've kept hidden for 20 years will come out." The Admiral looked at the secure display showing the trial chamber, where Kate Morrison sat calmly waiting for a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. The woman who had once been Ghost 77 looked smaller and older than Grant remembered, but there was still something unbreakable in her posture. "Maybe it's time," Grant said finally. "Maybe some secrets are more expensive to keep than they are to reveal." Hayes cut the connection without another word, leaving Grant alone in the secure chamber with the weight of 20 years of buried truth. Through the reinforced walls, she could hear the sounds of the station's normal operations. Alien beings and humans working together in the kind of peaceful cooperation that the Nightfall operation had been designed to protect. But peace built on lies was a fragile thing, and Grant could feel the cracks starting to show. In a few minutes, she would have to return to the courtroom and watch as one woman's quiet words brought down the carefully constructed barriers that had kept humanity's darkest secrets hidden. She activated her personal files, accessing documentation that officially didn't exist. The evidence was all there, waiting to be revealed. 20 years of classified reports, intercepted communications, and biological weapon specifications that would shock the galactic community and possibly tear the Alliance apart. The choice was no longer whether to reveal the truth. Kate Morrison had already made that decision when she spoke her old call sign in open court. Now the only question was how much damage the truth would cause and whether humanity could survive the consequences of its own necessary evil. 3 levels beneath the Colorado Rocky Mountains, in a facility that appeared on no official maps and consumed enough power to run a small city, President Helen Davis sat at the head of a table that hadn't been used for emergency sessions in over a decade. The room was carved from solid granite and lined with quantum shielding that could block everything from radio waves to exotic particles that most people couldn't even pronounce. The faces around the table belonged to people who had been pulled from retirement, vacation, and in one case a hospital bed. These were the guardians of America's deepest secrets, the men and women who knew about programs that existed in the shadows between official acknowledgement and complete denial. General Peter Hayes appeared on the main holographic display, his image transmitted through encryption so advanced that the mathematics behind it were themselves classified. Behind him, the Pentagon's Emergency Command Center hummed with activity as analysts tried to assess the damage from Kate Morrison's revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," President Davis began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her entire political career dealing with impossible situations. "We have a problem that threatens not just national security, but the entire foundation of human participation in the Galactic Alliance." She gestured, and the room's displays came alive with classified documents that hadn't been accessed in 20 years. Operation Nightfall spread across multiple screens in all its terrible detail. Biological weapon specifications, intercepted communications, Intelligence reports that painted a picture of planned genocide on a scale that made humanity's worst historical atrocities look small by comparison. Secretary of Defense Monica Bell leaned forward in her chair, studying the documents with the expression of someone seeing them for the first time. These files were classified beyond black. I've held the highest security clearances in government for 15 years, and I've never seen any of this material. Because officially, none of it exists, replied Director Caroline Webb of the Central Intelligence Agency. She looked older than her 60 years, the weight of keeping too many secrets etched into the lines around her eyes. Operation Nightfall was compartmentalized to the point where even the people running it didn't know the full scope. President Davis activated another display, showing video footage from 20 years ago. The image was grainy and obviously taken from a long-range surveillance platform, but it clearly showed a human fighter craft approaching a large transport ship. The timestamp in the corner showed a date that everyone in the room remembered for different reasons. Kate Morrison, call sign Ghost 77, received direct authorization to fire on the Harmony's Dream at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time. She had 17 minutes to make a decision that would either save 3 billion human lives or let her be branded a war criminal forever. The footage played out in silence as Morrison's fighter opened fire. The transport ship, clearly marked with civilian identification codes and refugee protection symbols, exploded in a brilliant flash that briefly overloaded the surveillance cameras. When the image cleared, there was nothing left but debris and the expanding gas cloud of a catastrophic hull breach. The cover story was Morrison's idea. General Hayes continued from his remote location. She volunteered to take the blame to protect the intelligence sources that had uncovered the Velnari pathogen project. We gave her a new identity and listed her as killed in action along with the rest of Ghost Squadron. Attorney General Robert Kane, who had been taking notes throughout the briefing, looked up with the expression of someone who was trying to reconcile legal theory with impossible reality. Let me understand this correctly. We ordered one of our pilots to destroy what appeared to be a civilian refugee transport. When questioned about it, we allowed her to be branded a war criminal rather than reveal the truth. For 20 years, we've let the galactic community believe that humans are capable of mass murder, rather than admit that we stopped an act of biological warfare. That's correct, President Davis replied. And now Kate Morrison has revealed her true identity in open court, which means we have to decide whether to continue the deception or reveal secrets that could start a war. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of the decision they faced. The evidence of the Velnari pathogen project was undeniable once you had access to the classified files. But revealing it would expose not just the biological weapons program, but also the existence of Ghost Squadron and the black operations that had kept humanity alive during the dangerous early years of galactic integration. National Security Advisor Patricia Coleman had been quiet throughout the briefing, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent her career analyzing threats that most people couldn't imagine. The Velnari pathogen was specifically designed to target human DNA. Intelligence indicated that it would have a 97% fatality rate among human populations and would be completely harmless to every other known species. The attack was planned to coincide with harvest festivals on New Geneva, Terra Nova, and Kepler Prime, when population density would ensure maximum casualties. She activated another display showing population projections and casualty estimates. The numbers were staggering. 3 billion human lives spread across 3 separate colony worlds, all wiped out by a biological weapon that would have looked like a natural plague to anyone who didn't know the truth. The pathogen was designed to be self-limiting, Coleman continued. After achieving maximum saturation in human populations, it would break down naturally, leaving no trace of its artificial origin. The Velnari extremists planned to offer humanitarian aid to the surviving human settlements, positioning themselves as the galaxy's saviors while secretly celebrating the near extinction of our species. President Davis watched the faces around the table as the full scope of the plot became clear. These were people who had seen classified intelligence from every corner of human space, who were accustomed to dealing with threats that ranged from routine espionage to potential alien invasion. But the casual calculation of the Velnari genocide plan clearly shocked even these hardened professionals. Ghost Squadron consisted of 12 pilots, all volunteers for the most dangerous missions in human space. General Hayes continued. Kate Morrison was their squadron leader, chosen for her ability to make impossible decisions under extreme pressure. When intelligence confirmed that the Harmony's dream was carrying the pathogen, she had less than 20 minutes to intercept. The Attorney General was studying legal precedents on his personal display, trying to find some framework for understanding the situation they faced. From a legal standpoint, Morrison was acting under direct orders from the highest levels of government to prevent an act of genocide. Her actions were not only justified but necessary. From a political standpoint, revealing the truth could destroy the Galactic Alliance, Secretary Bell countered. The Velnari delegation will deny everything. They'll claim that we fabricated evidence to justify war crimes. Other species will have to choose between believing humans or believing that we're capable of massive deception. President Davis looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent their careers protecting American interests and human survival. Each of them understood the terrible mathematics of the decision they faced. Save one woman and possibly start a war, or let an innocent person die to protect a secret that had kept the peace for 20 years. There's another factor we need to consider, Director Webb said quietly. Kate Morrison has been living under a false identity for 2 decades. She's had no contact with her old life. No recognition for her service, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice she made. She saved humanity and we thanked her by erasing her from existence. The weight of that truth settled over the room like a physical presence. They had asked one woman to carry the burden of being seen as a monster, so that billions of humans could continue to live in peace. For 20 years, Kate Morrison had been the living embodiment of humanity's necessary evil, a reminder of the prices that survival sometimes demanded. President Davis looked at the clock on the wall. The trial would reconvene in less than an hour, and Judge Veltar would demand answers that could reshape the entire galactic political landscape. The decision they made in this room would determine not just Kate Morrison's fate, but potentially the future of human civilization among the stars. Options? She asked, though she suspected that all of their choices would be terrible in their own way. The secure chamber aboard Kepler Station was smaller than Admiral Grant remembered from her last visit 20 years ago. The walls hummed with electromagnetic shielding that blocked every known form of surveillance, creating a pocket of privacy in the middle of one of the galaxy's busiest diplomatic stations. 2 chairs faced each other across a simple metal table, and in one of them sat the woman who had once been the most classified asset in human military history. Kate Morrison looked older than her 62 years. Her gray hair was streaked with white, and lines of stress had etched themselves deep around her eyes and mouth. She wore the simple orange jumpsuit of a prisoner awaiting trial, but she sat with the straight-backed posture of someone who had never forgotten her military training. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, steady despite everything that had happened. Admiral Grant took the chair across from her old friend, studying a face that had haunted her dreams for 2 decades. The last time they had been in the same room, Kate Morrison had been volunteering to disappear forever, so that humanity's darkest secrets could remain buried. Now those secrets were threatening to tear apart everything they had worked to protect. Kate, Grant said softly, using her friend's real name for the first time in 20 years. When we buried Ghost Squadron, we agreed it would stay buried. Morrison's gray eyes met Grant's without flinching. There was no anger there, no bitterness about the life she had sacrificed or the recognition she had been denied. Just the same steady resolve that had made her the perfect choice to lead humanity's most dangerous missions. They're going to execute me for war crimes. Lisa, Morrison replied, using the Admiral's first name with the familiarity of someone who had served alongside her through the worst conflicts in human history. The Harmony's dream wasn't a refugee transport. You and I both know what it really was. Grant's hands trembled slightly as she activated her personal access codes, sequences that she had memorized decades ago and hoped never to use. The holographic display that materialized between them showed files that officially didn't exist, classified at levels that required presidential authorization just to acknowledge their existence. The evidence suggests otherwise, Grant said carefully, though her voice lacked conviction. She was following procedure, going through the motions of maintaining official denial even though they both knew the truth. Morrison leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the quiet tone she had always used when discussing matters of life and death. Lisa, that ship was carrying something that would have killed every human colony in the Outer Rim. We didn't murder refugees. We prevented genocide. The classified documents began to populate the display as Grant's access codes were verified and cross-referenced through multiple security agencies. Intelligence reports from 20 years ago painted a picture of biological warfare that made the ancient chemical weapons look primitive by comparison. The Velnari pathogen project had been years in development, a carefully engineered virus that could distinguish between human and alien DNA with terrifying precision. Grant read the familiar reports with the same sick feeling she had experienced when she first saw them 2 decades ago. The pathogen was designed to be perfect in its lethality against humans, while leaving every other known species completely unaffected. It would spread through human populations like wildfire, killing with a 97% fatality rate while appearing to be nothing more than a particularly virulent natural plague. The Velnari pathogen, Grant whispered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. They were going to deploy it at New Geneva during the Harvest Festival. Morrison nodded grimly. 3 billion humans would have died within a month. Ghost 77 received emergency authorization to intercept. We saved humanity, Lisa, and they're going to kill me for it. The intelligence reports showed the careful planning that had gone into the attack. The Harmony's dream had been chosen specifically because its refugee status would protect it from casual inspection. The ship's manifest listed over 3,000 Velnari civilians fleeing from border conflicts, complete with individual biographies and family histories that would have passed any reasonable security check. But buried in the ship's cargo hold, hidden among legitimate medical supplies and food shipments, were canisters containing enough weaponized pathogen to kill every human being on 3 separate worlds. The deployment plan was elegant in its simplicity. The ship would dock at New Geneva during the colony's biggest celebration, when population density was at its highest and security was traditionally relaxed. The pathogen would be released into the air filtration systems of the major population centers. By the time the first symptoms appeared, it would already be too late. The virus would spread faster than any quarantine could contain it, jumping from world to world through normal trade and travel routes. Within weeks, the Outer Rim colonies would be empty of human life. Grant activated another file, showing the intercept mission that had led to Kate Morrison's current situation. Ghost Squadron had been scrambled with less than 30 minutes' notice. Their fighters launched from a classified facility that appeared on no official records. They had 17 minutes to reach the Harmony's dream before it entered New Geneva's shipping lanes. The mission parameters had been clear and terrible. Intercept the target. Verify the intelligence. If confirmed, destroy the ship with all hands. No survivors. No witnesses. No possibility that even a single canister of the pathogen could reach its intended destination. Morrison had been the squadron leader, the pilot with the best record for making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. When the moment came to fire, she had pulled the trigger without hesitation, knowing that she was killing 3,000 innocent beings to save 3 billion humans who would never know they had been in danger. The cover story was your idea, Grant said, her voice heavy with remembered guilt. You said it was better to let one person carry the blame than to expose the truth and watch the alliance tear itself apart. Morrison's expression didn't change. It was the right decision then, and it's still the right decision now. If the galactic community learns that the Velnari were planning genocide, it will mean war. If they learn that humans are capable of the kind of black operations that made Ghost Squadron possible, it will mean isolation. Either way, humanity loses. The Admiral studied her old friend's face, looking for some sign of the cost that 20 years of carrying this secret had demanded. Morrison had volunteered to be erased from existence, to give up her name, her career, her entire identity, so that the truth about the Velnari pathogen could remain buried. She had lived for 2 decades as a ghost, watching from the shadows as humanity prospered in the peace that her sacrifice had helped to maintain. But now they know about Ghost 77, Grant said. The moment you spoke that call sign, you triggered protocols that are going to bring everything into the open. 20 years of classified operations, black budgets, intelligence sources that we've protected at the cost of human lives. It's all going to come out. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the secure chamber. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried the weight of someone who had made peace with impossible choices long ago. "Maybe it's time," she said simply. "Maybe some secrets are too expensive to keep. 3 billion humans are alive today because Ghost Squadron was willing to do what needed to be done. If the price of that truth is my life, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." Grant felt tears she hadn't shed in decades threatening to fall. The woman sitting across from her had already given up everything for humanity's survival. Her name, her identity, her recognition as one of the greatest heroes in human history. Now she was prepared to give up her life as well, if that's what it took to finally tell the truth about the choice she had made in the darkness between the stars. The Galactic Council's emergency session convened in the Great Assembly Hall of Kepler Station, a massive chamber designed to accommodate the diverse physical needs of 17 different species. The air was thick with tension as representatives from across the galaxy took their assigned positions, their various forms of communication creating a babble of sounds that the universal translators struggled to process. Simultaneously, Ambassador Zekthar of the Velnari delegation coiled his serpentine body around the speaking platform, his scales shifting through the deep red patterns that indicated extreme agitation among his people. His voice carried the hissing quality that all Velnari possessed, but the translator converted his words into the common tongue with crystal clarity. "The humans mock this tribunal," he declared, his words echoing through the chamber's acoustic enhancement systems. "They claim military secrets while one of their butchers faces justice for mass murder. How convenient that these classified protocols appear exactly when their war criminal is about to face execution." The insect-like representatives of the Kree collective clicked their mandibles in agreement, their compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that showed support for the Velnari position. The crystalline beings from the Andor system chimed softly, their bodies resonating with harmonics that expressed similar sentiments but in the secured communication channels that connected Earth's leadership with their diplomatic representatives throughout the galaxy. A very different conversation was taking place. President Helen Davis found herself connected to prime ministers, chancellors, and presidents from every human colony world, all demanding answers about Kate Morrison and the mysterious protocols that had brought the trial to a halt. The evidence was spread across multiple, secure displays in communication centers throughout human space. Intelligence reports that painted a picture of biological warfare on a scale that made historical weapons of mass destruction look primitive. Intercepted communications showing casual discussions of human extinction. Biological weapon specifications that detailed exactly how to kill 3 billion people, while making it look like a natural plague. "If we reveal the truth about the Velnari pathogen project," President Davis explained to the assembled human leadership, "we save Morrison, but potentially start a war that could tear the Galactic Alliance apart. The Velnari will deny everything. They'll claim we fabricated evidence to justify war crimes." Chancellor Maria Santos of the Terra Nova colony leaned forward in her chair, her face showing the strain of someone who was trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about galactic politics. "You're telling me that the Velnari extremists plan to commit genocide against humanity, and we've been keeping it secret for 20 years to maintain diplomatic relations?" "That's exactly what we're telling you," replied General Hayes from his position in the Pentagon's Emergency Command Center. The Harmony's dream was carrying enough weaponized pathogen to kill every human on 3 separate worlds. Kate Morrison destroyed it on direct orders from the highest levels of government. Prime Minister Chen Williams of New Geneva Colony went pale as he processed the implications. His world had been the primary target of the planned attack, chosen because its harvest festival would provide the perfect cover for deploying a biological weapon among the largest possible number of human civilians. 3 billion people, he whispered. They were going to kill 3 billion people and make it look like a plague. The secure communication channels crackled with urgent discussions, as human leaders throughout the galaxy tried to come to terms with the reality of what they were hearing. These were people who had built their careers on diplomacy and peaceful cooperation with alien species. The idea that one of their closest allies had been planning their extinction was almost too terrible to process, but the evidence was undeniable. 20 years of classified intelligence reports showed the development of the pathogen project from its earliest stages. Intercepted communications revealed the casual way that Velnari extremists had discussed the complete elimination of humanity. Biological weapon specifications detailed exactly how the virus had been engineered to distinguish between human and alien DNA. Admiral Grant's voice came through the secure channels from her position aboard Kepler Station, where she could see the political storm brewing among the various alien delegations. The Velnari mainstream government claims they had no knowledge of the extremist faction's activities, she reported. But our intelligence shows that several high-ranking officials were aware of the pathogen project and chose to look the other way. The implications were staggering. If the truth came out, it would mean that humanity's closest allies in the galactic community had been harboring elements that wanted to commit genocide against the human species. The carefully constructed diplomatic relationships that had taken decades to build would collapse overnight. President Davis looked at the faces of her advisors, seeing her own terrible realization reflected in their expressions. They were faced with an impossible choice between justice and survival, between truth and the peace that had allowed human civilization to flourish among the stars. "What are our options?" asked Prime Minister Elizabeth Carter of Kepler Prime, though her tone suggested she already knew that all their choices would be terrible. Secretary of Defense Monica Bell activated another display showing casualty projections and political analysis from the State Department's best strategic minds. Option 1. We reveal the truth about the pathogen project and save Morrison. This likely starts a war with the Velnari and possibly fractures the entire galactic alliance. Human colonies would be isolated and vulnerable to attack from species who see us as dangerous liars. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. Option 2. We maintain the cover story and let Morrison face execution. We preserve the alliance and keep humanity's place in the galactic community. But we sacrifice an innocent woman who saved 3 billion lives. The silence that followed was broken by Prime Minister Williams, whose voice carried the weight of someone who was trying to reconcile moral absolutes with political realities. There has to be a third option. We can't let Kate Morrison die for saving humanity. But we also can't start a war that could destroy everything we've built. Attorney General Robert Kane had been quiet throughout most of the discussion, but now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent his career finding legal solutions to impossible problems. There is a third option, but it's incredibly dangerous. We could reveal selected portions of the truth, enough to establish Morrison's innocence without exposing the full scope of our intelligence capabilities or the extent of the Velnari plot. President Davis shook her head. Partial revelation is the worst of both worlds. We'd be seen as manipulating evidence while still revealing enough classified material to damage our intelligence networks. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Judge Feltar's chambers. The Galactic War Crimes Tribunal was preparing to reconvene, and the judge was demanding immediate answers about the human military protocols that had brought the proceedings to a halt. General Hayes consulted with his staff before reporting the latest intelligence from Kepler Station. The alien delegations are getting restless. Some are calling for immediate judgment against Morrison, regardless of any classified protocols. Others are demanding that we reveal our evidence or face sanctions for obstructing galactic justice. President Davis felt the weight of 3 billion human lives pressing down on her as she contemplated the decision that would define her presidency and possibly determine the future of human civilization among the stars. Kate Morrison had faced a similar choice 20 years ago, when she had 17 minutes to decide between saving humanity and preserving her own reputation. Now it was the president's turn to make an impossible choice, and she had even less time than Morrison had been given. In a few minutes, she would have to decide whether to sacrifice one woman's life to preserve the peace or reveal the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Veltar reconvened the tribunal. Representatives from every major species in the Galactic Alliance had somehow found seats, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and textures that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But there was nothing beautiful about the tension that filled the crystal chamber like a living thing, pressing against the walls and making the air itself seem thick and dangerous. Admiral Lisa Grant stood at the witness podium, her dress uniform, bearing decorations from conflicts that most of the beings in the courtroom had never heard of. The medals represented decades of service in humanity's expansion into galactic space, but they also represented secrets that had been buried so deep that even their existence was classified beyond most people's understanding. Judge Veltar's 4 glowing eyes focused on Grant with the intensity of someone who had presided over hundreds of trials and knew when witnesses were about to reveal something that would change everything. His translator sparked occasionally as it processed the complex emotions radiating from the various species in attendance. "Admiral Grant," the judge said, his voice carrying the authority of galactic law, "you will explain the meaning of the call sign Ghost 77 and its relevance to these proceedings." Grant looked across the courtroom to where Kate Morrison sat at the defendant's table. Her old friend's gray eyes met hers with the same steady resolve that had made her the perfect choice to lead humanity's most dangerous missions. There was no fear there, no plea for mercy, just the quiet acceptance of someone who had already given up everything for humanity's survival and was prepared to give up her life as well. "Your Honor," Grant began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. The defendant, Kate Morrison, was not acting as a rogue pilot when she destroyed the transport ship Harmony's Dream. She was operating under direct orders from Earth Command as part of a classified anti-terrorism operation. The courtroom erupted in protests from the alien delegates. Ambassador Zekthar uncoiled from his position with violent speed, his scales flashing the deep red patterns that showed extreme anger among his people. The insect-like Kree delegation clicked their mandibles in sounds that the translators rendered as expressions of disbelief and outrage. But Grant continued over their objections, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with impossible situations. Ghost 77 was her operational call sign during a mission to prevent an act of biological warfare against human civilian populations. She activated the holographic display system, and classified documents began to appear in the air above the courtroom. Intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and biological weapon specifications filled the space with evidence that had been hidden for 20 years. The effect on the assembled delegates was immediate and dramatic. The pathogen specifications were particularly damning, showing a level of biological engineering that went far beyond anything most species thought possible. The virus had been designed with terrifying precision to target human DNA, while leaving every other known species completely unaffected. It was genocide made manifest in microscopic form, a weapon that could kill billions while appearing to be nothing more than a natural plague. The ship she destroyed was carrying a weaponized pathogen designed specifically to target human genetic markers. Grant continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Intelligence indicated it was to be deployed at New Geneva Colony during their harvest festival, when population density would ensure maximum casualties. The intercepted communications were even more shocking than the biological specifications. Velnari extremists discussing the complete extinction of humanity with the casual tone of people planning a dinner party. References to the human problem and the need for a final solution that would free the galaxy from what they saw as a violent and dangerous species. Ambassador Zekthar rose from his position again, his serpentine body coiling with rage as he pointed an accusing finger at the holographic displays. "These are fabrications," he hissed, his words translated for all to hear. "Lies designed to excuse mass murder. The humans create false evidence to justify their war crimes. But other species' intelligence agencies were already confirming pieces of the puzzle through their own channels." The crystalline beings of the Andor system chimed in harmonies that showed growing concern as they cross-referenced the intelligence reports with their own classified files. Even the normally skeptical Kree Collective was finding corroborating evidence in their historical databases. Grant activated another display showing casualty projections and deployment scenarios. The numbers were staggering in their scope and terrible in their precision. 3 billion humans across 3 separate worlds, all targeted for elimination, during holiday celebrations when their guard would be down and their population density would be highest. The pathogen was designed to be self-limiting, Grant explained, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. After achieving maximum saturation in human populations, it would break down naturally, leaving no trace of its artificial origin. The perpetrators planned to offer humanitarian aid to any surviving human settlements, positioning themselves as the galaxy's saviors while secretly celebrating the near extinction of our species. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. Even the ambient sounds of the station's life support system seemed muted, as hundreds of beings tried to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a war crime or an act of terrorism. This was planned genocide on a scale that made historical atrocities look small by comparison. Judge Veltar studied the evidence with all four of his glowing eyes, his translator working overtime to process the complex biological and tactical data. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced even the most vocal protesters. These documents, if authentic, suggest a conspiracy to commit genocide against the human species. Grant nodded grimly. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had less than 20 minutes to make a decision that would either save 3 billion human lives or allow the complete extinction of humanity in the Outer Rim colonies. She chose to fire on what appeared to be a civilian transport, because our intelligence indicated it was actually a weapon of mass destruction, disguised as a refugee ship. The Velnari delegation was in chaos. Several of their junior representatives had gone pale as they realized the implications of what was being revealed. Ambassador Zekthar's scales had shifted from red to a sickly yellow color that showed fear and confusion among his people. Kate Morrison finally stood to address the court, her voice no longer the whisper it had been when she first spoke her call sign. She looked directly at Judge Veltar, then at the alien observers who had been calling for her execution just hours before. "I destroyed the Harmony's dream because it wasn't what it appeared to be," she said, her words carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "We had 17 minutes to stop a weapon that would have killed 3 billion innocent people. I made the choice to save them, knowing it would cost me everything." She turned to look directly at Ambassador Zekthar, her gray eyes meeting his serpentine gaze without flinching. "Your extremists dressed their weapon of mass destruction as a refugee ship, using innocent lives as camouflage. They calculated that we wouldn't fire on refugees, that human compassion would be their shield." The ambassador's scales shifted through several color patterns as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The evidence was overwhelming, corroborated by multiple intelligence agencies and supported by biological specifications that would have been impossible to fabricate. Judge Veltar raised his gavel, but before he could speak, President Davis's voice came through the communication system, transmitted from the secure bunker deep beneath the Colorado mountains. "Your Honor, humanity has always reserved the right to defend itself by any means necessary. We joined the galactic community as equals, not as subjects. The operation that saved 3 billion human lives was conducted under the legal authority of our sovereign government." The courtroom fell into complete silence as the full scope of the revelation settled over the assembled delegates. This wasn't just about one pilot's decision to fire on a civilian transport. This was about the discovery that one of humanity's closest allies had been harboring elements that wanted to commit genocide, and that humans had been forced to conduct black operations to protect themselves from extinction. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the ambient hum of Kepler Station's life support system seemed deafeningly loud. Hundreds of beings from 17 different species sat motionless as they tried to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The holographic displays still glowed with evidence of planned genocide, biological weapon specifications, and intercepted communications that painted a picture of casual cruelty that shocked even the most hardened diplomatic observers. Judge Veltar's 4 eyes moved slowly across the assembled evidence, his translator working to process not just the technical specifications but the terrible implications of what they meant. The pathogen design was particularly damning, showing a level of biological warfare that violated every treaty and moral principle that held the Galactic Alliance together. Ambassador Zekthar remained coiled in his position, but his scales had shifted to the pale gray color that indicated shock and confusion among his people. Several other members of the Velnari delegation had quietly begun accessing their own communication devices, speaking in urgent whispers to contacts back on their homeworld. The crystalline beings of the Andor system were chiming softly among themselves, their harmonic conversations creating patterns that the universal translators rendered as expressions of profound disturbance. Even the normally calm, tree-like representatives of the Groot Collective were rustling their leaves in ways that suggested deep agitation. Kate Morrison remained standing at the defendant's table, her hands folded behind her back in the parade rest position she had learned decades ago in basic training. The defeated slump that had characterized her posture for the first 2 days of the trial was completely gone, replaced by the rigid bearing of a career military officer who had nothing left to hide. Judge Veltar finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight that had accumulated over the course of the revelation. Each word seemed to cost him effort as he struggled to reconcile the evidence with everything he thought he knew about galactic politics. The evidence presented to this tribunal suggests that Lieutenant Commander Morrison acted to prevent an act of genocide against the human species. However, these revelations also expose troubling questions about the nature of intelligence operations conducted by human governmental agencies. He gestured to the holographic displays, which still showed classified documents that painted humanity's survival in shades of gray that made many of the alien observers uncomfortable. The biological weapon specifications indicate a level of sophistication that suggests state-sponsored development. The intercepted communications show planning at the highest levels of Velnari extremist organizations. If this evidence is authentic, then the attack on the transport ship Harmony's Dream was not a war crime, but a legitimate act of self-defense. President Davis's voice came through the secure communication system, transmitted from the bunker beneath Colorado, where the highest levels of human government had been wrestling with impossible decisions. Your Honor, the evidence is authentic. It has been verified by multiple intelligence agencies and corroborated by biological analysis, conducted by independent scientific institutions. The pathogen samples recovered from the debris of the Harmony's Dream match the specifications exactly. The courtroom stirred as this new information was processed. Independent verification meant that this wasn't just human propaganda designed to excuse war crimes. The biological weapon had been real, and Kate Morrison had destroyed it just minutes before it could be deployed against civilian populations. Admiral Grant stepped forward from her position at the witness podium, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of buried guilt and necessary secrets. Your Honor, Kate Morrison volunteered to be branded a war criminal to protect the intelligence sources that had uncovered this plot. For 20 years, she has lived under a false identity, carrying the burden of being seen as a monster by the very people she saved. The personal cost of the deception was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. Morrison hadn't just risked her life to save 3 billion humans. She had sacrificed her identity, her recognition, her entire existence to protect secrets that could have destabilized the Galactic Alliance. Morrison spoke for the final time, her voice carrying clearly through the crystal chamber without the need for amplification. I destroyed that ship because I had 17 minutes to choose between 3,000 lives and 3 billion lives. I made the choice that any human would have made, knowing that it would cost me everything I had ever been. She looked directly at the alien observers who had spent 2 days calling for her execution. I don't ask for forgiveness because I know that some of you will never be able to forgive what I did. I only ask that you understand why it was necessary. Judge Veltar consulted with his legal advisors for several minutes, their complex conversation creating harmonic patterns that the translators couldn't fully process. When he finally returned his attention to the courtroom, his 4 eyes seemed dimmer than they had been at the beginning of the trial. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this tribunal finds that the defendant Kate Morrison, callsign Ghost 77, acted under lawful military authority to prevent an act of genocide against human civilian populations. All charges of war crimes and mass murder are hereby dismissed. The courtroom remained silent as the magnitude of the ruling settled over the assembled delegates. Morrison was free, but the revelation of the Velnari pathogen project had opened wounds that might never heal. Judge Veltar continued, his voice heavy with the burden of making decisions that would affect the future of galactic civilization. However, this tribunal must also address the broader implications of what has been revealed today. The existence of classified military operations that operate outside the knowledge of the galactic community raises serious questions about the nature of human participation in the alliance. President Davis responded immediately, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her entire career dealing with threats that most people couldn't Imagine, humanity has always reserved the right to defend itself by any means necessary. We joined the galactic community as equals, not as subjects. The operations that saved 3 billion human lives were conducted under the legal authority of our sovereign government and in response to an existential threat to our species. The political implications were staggering. If humanity had the right to conduct secret military operations to protect itself, then so did every other species in the alliance. The careful balance of trust and cooperation that had held the galactic community together for decades was suddenly in question. Ambassador Zekthar finally found his voice, though his words came out as a hiss that the translators rendered with obvious difficulty. The Velnari government categorically denies any knowledge of the extremist activities described in these documents. If such a plot existed, it was conducted without official authorization and represents the actions of rogue elements within our society. But the damage was already done. The evidence was too detailed and too well corroborated for anyone to dismiss it as fabrication. The pathogen project had been real, the genocide had been planned, and Kate Morrison had stopped it with minutes to spare. Judge Veltar delivered his final ruling after another lengthy consultation with his advisors. Lieutenant Commander Morrison is cleared of all charges and is free to go. However, humanity must accept formal censure for conducting classified military operations in violation of galactic transparency protocols. This censure will remain in effect pending a full review of human military activities by the Galactic Security Council. As the courtroom began to empty, Morrison approached Admiral Grant one final time. The two women who had once served together in humanity's darkest hour now faced an uncertain future where their secrets were no longer secret. "What happens now?" Morrison asked quietly. Grant looked at her old friend, seeing for the first time in 20 years the woman she remembered from before the weight of terrible choices had aged them both beyond their years. "Now you get to live again," Grant replied. "Ghost 77 died 20 years ago when we buried the truth. Today Kate Morrison gets to come back to life." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that her old existence was truly over but that something new was beginning. The call sign that had once meant death and shadows now meant freedom, and the courtroom that had demanded her voice had finally heard the truth it needed to understand. As the various delegations filed out of the crystal chamber, the galaxy itself seemed different than it had been just hours before. Secrets that had shaped interspecies relations for decades were now in the open, and no one could predict what would grow in the harsh light of truth that had finally been allowed to shine.